Hello and welcome to Gallery Teaches. My name is Khanh-Duc Kuttig, and today's workshop is about how to give effective instructions. So, welcome. We're going to be talking about effective instructions. And this is what we'll be covering today. We're going to start with an opening reflection. Then we're going to look at what problems many of us have with our classroom instructions. We're going to then look at some tips to improve our instructions. And then we're going to close with a summary that brings everything together and also some reflection to take away. I'd like to begin by sharing this quote from Jim Scrivener's book, Classroom Management Techniques. Let's look at this together. He writes, even though they may sometimes only last as little as 5 or 10 seconds, the times when you give instructions are critical moments in any lesson. Get them wrong, and they will cause problems that ripple through the following activity and on into the rest of the lesson. It is very often the learners who get blamed for doing things wrongly, when the real problem was actually the original instruction. Let's pick up what he says here at the end of the quote, this little bit that I've highlighted here in purple. It is often the learners who get blamed for doing things wrongly, but the problem is actually the original instruction. We've all been there. We've given an instruction, we've prepared the activity, we've prepared the instruction to our mind, from our perspective. There was nothing remotely complex or difficult. And yet, our learners just do the exact opposite of what we wanted them to do, or don't even do what we want them to do. And then we get cross with them, and we tell them off, and we get angry because we feel that they weren't paying attention. But have we looked back and reflected on the instruction itself and considered that maybe, despite what we think, the problem may have been in the instruction themselves? Well, let's take a look and consider how and why instructions go wrong. Okay, let's reflect a little and consider what the problems with our original instructions could have been. Now, first of all, we've given the instructions too soon. Our students weren't ready. They've just come into class. They haven't seen their classmates in a long time. So they were distracted. They were chatting with each other. And they simply weren't listening to you. Now, that's something we've got to deal with. Another problem is the information overload. Now, remember that most people usually only remember the beginning and end of a piece of discourse. And the more information you pack into your instruction, the more your learners are going to switch off. So they'll only hear your opening. For instance, you want to do a role play, and you begin by saying, class, today we're going to do a role play. And they've heard that and they think, all right, okay, now we know what to do. And they switch off. And then they only hear the end when you give them the cue to work, when you say, let's get into groups. And all that information in between gets lost. Now, do you sometimes notice how your students seem confused when you give an instruction? Well, maybe also it's the language you use when giving instructions. You're long-winded, there's no signposting, your instructions lack organization. So it's not always the students who are at fault when things don't go right in class. Considering all these problems, let's look at how we can make our instructions better. Now, first and foremost, for an instruction to be heard and understood, avoid rushing straight into the instruction. Okay? We often feel like we have so much to cover and our students need to know so much that every single second we have counts. But all this time is lost if you end up needing to repeat yourself 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. and also managing students who are lost, going around the classroom, making sure they're on the right page, making sure they're working in the right size groups. So the best thing to do is to begin by making sure that your students are not distracted. You need their full attention. You need to be sure that their eyes and ears are on you, that they're listening to you, and that they're paying attention to you. Now, giving instructions also shouldn't be a race to the finish where you try to pack everything in the shortest possible time. Remember, less is more. Don't ramble. Don't go on and on and on. Keep your instructions simple and pause before giving more information. Compare these two examples. In the first version, the teacher says, I'd like you to work with a partner on this really interesting and important vocabulary activity so that you can have more speaking practice. Now, the teacher feels that this information is important. The teacher feels that it's important to highlight to the students that the vocabulary activity is interesting. The teacher feels that it's important that the students know the importance of the activity. And the teacher also feels that it's important for the students to know why they're doing the activity for that extra speaking practice. But that's just so much information packed into one instruction at one go. If we look at the second version, the teacher says, for this vocabulary activity, work with a partner. The teacher pauses before moving on to the next piece of information. So that's the first step. Work with a partner. Then perhaps the teacher gives out the handout or the teacher says, what they have to do next. Avoid complex language. Well, we're coming back to what was mentioned in the previous slide. Too much information, right? Information is often packed into complex language. Well, do try to avoid that. Use short sentences, such as find a partner, compared to I'd like you to please find someone you can work with. Secondly, don't put more than one instruction in one sentence. Chunk them, one piece of information at a time. Now, in this activity that you see on the screen that's coming up, the teacher wants to do a relatively simple activity, which, however, has a number of steps to it. So in this activity, if I'll explain it to you briefly, it's a speaking activity and the students first have to draw a star on a sheet of paper. And then on each point of the star, the students have to write something. Now look at what the teacher does in this first version of the instruction. The teacher says, take out a sheet of paper and draw a 5-pointed star. Then on the first point, write a number that is important to you. On the second, write the name of a person. And on the third, write a place that's important to you. Now, who's going to remember what they're supposed to write on each of the points? Notice also how the teacher doesn't pause between the two stages, the taking out a sheet of paper and drawing a 5-pointed star. The teacher just goes straight into the instructions. Take out a sheet of paper and draw a 5-pointed star, then on the first point. Okay? Now, what should the teacher do instead? As we said, give one piece of information at a time and check at each stage of the way that your students are with you and that you've still got their attention. Now, I've done this activity with university students quite frequently, and I've had students who use sheets of paper of all sizes. So in the first stage, you want them to take out a sheet of paper and you go, take out a sheet of paper. I've had students taking out paper this size, and then I've had students taking out sheets of paper this size, right? Your regular A4 sheet of paper. And then with the stars, I've had students draw tiny stars, huge stars, and some didn't even know what a 5-pointed star was. So don't assume. You tell them, take out a sheet of paper, an A4 sheet of paper. Check that everybody has a sheet of paper. Tell them to draw the 5-pointed star, right? So you go, now draw a 5-pointed star on it in the middle of the page, a big one. So the teacher checks that the students know what a 5-pointed star is and that they're drawing a nice big one. And then when they've done, give them the next step of the instruction. On the first point, write a number that is important for you. And wait for them to finish that step before going on to the next step. Okay? Connected to that, what's really helpful and actually quite logical is to give the instructions in the order that you want your students to follow them. So sequence one step at a time. And as I mentioned, always pause in between each step. Last but not least, use words and phrases like now, first, next, finally, which will help guide your students every step of the way. Now, another thing is showing, not just telling. Now, what we want our students to do may seem so obvious to us, and this is probably because we've done the activity so often with other students or with the same group of students. Now, however, from the student's point of view, what we want them to do may not necessarily be clear to them. So don't just tell them what to do. Show them. And how do we do that? Show them by indicating the task. Hold up the book and say, for example, do this exercise at the top left corner here, the one labeled B. And if any extra materials are needed, you could hold these up and show them to the class. Use the class dictionaries and work with your vocabulary notebooks. So you could be holding up the vocabulary notebook and the class dictionaries. If you're working on an interactive whiteboard, you could also zoom in to the respective activity or the task. If you have set an exercise, you could do 1 or 2 examples with the class to help them understand what they need to do. In the case of the 5-pointed star, you draw the 5-pointed star on the board for them to see. In other cases, a demonstration may be more appropriate. Perhaps you're doing a miming activity to practice the present continuous. Well, then you could demonstrate what it means to mime, and you could also show what you expect the rest of the class who are watching the mime. You could demonstrate what you expect them to do. Do you want them to write the answer on a sheet of paper? Do you want them to put their hands up to give their answers? For pair work or other group tasks, you could demonstrate by role-playing with one or a few of the students so that the class can see what each person or what the group needs to do. Now, you don't have to do the entire activity for your demonstration. Okay, just the beginning, which really usually helps students to grasp what you want them to do. So, how can we check if our students have understood what we want them to do? Do you ask, has everyone understood what to do? How many of your students have actually then put up their hands and said they haven't understood or asked for clarification? Now, usually you should be able to tell if your students have understood your instructions. So usually you don't even need to ask, right? You'll either see confusion in their faces and then they'll be sitting there looking quite lost, or you'll have a class that quickly gets into action. But rather than wait for either reaction, you can spend a mere 2 minutes of your class time to check if everything you have said is clear. So let's see how we can do this. Here are some tips. One really effective way of checking understanding is to get students to tell you what they have to do. But don't just say to the class, right, class, tell me now what you have to do. A good way of getting them to tell you what to do is to call on individual students to tell the class the different pieces of information one at a time. You could pick the students according to their level of ability, according to their confidence as well, and ask them to give you the individual steps of the activity. With a lower level or a less confident class, you could ask checking questions, such as the ones here on this list. Which task do you have to complete? Which do you not have to do? How long do you have for this? How many students should there be in each group? And if you want to tap into the knowledge of stronger students in a mixed ability class, you could get the stronger students to repeat the instructions in the first language if you've got a monolingual class. If your learners in one class do not share the same first language, what you can do is you could get the stronger students to demonstrate the activity or to explain the activity or explain the instructions in English to the rest of the class. And what you can do is, instead of having them speak to the class as a whole, you could put them into groups, and in each group you could have one student repeat the instructions for their group members. You'll also have activities that you do quite regularly. And for variations of such activities, you could also get your students to prepare the instructions, especially for the more routine steps, such as first working alone, then in pairs, and then moving on into working in groups. So we've looked at the tips, we've looked at what causes instructions to fail, we've looked at how to fix these pitfalls, we've looked at how to get our students to show us that they've understood the instructions. Now let's look at ourselves. How can we become more confident in giving instructions? Well, it's as simple as practice makes perfect. It helps immensely if you know exactly what you want the class to do. If you're not sure, if you're unsure about an activity, it will reflect in your own instructions. Now, this is obviously much easier for textbook or workbook tasks, but less so for more creative activities such as role plays or games. And if you've never done that particular game or activity, you need to be sure that you know exactly what to do. So take the time to read through the activity, through the role play, through the game. Spend some time perhaps explaining it to another teacher, to a colleague, and then try to prepare your instructions in advance. Try noting down the language you'll use. Try to use the same routine phrases. Put the instructions down step by step. This will help you, and in the long run, it'll help your learners as well. In addition to that, we have a framework for instructions. Many of our instructions contain some or all of the elements here that I'm going to present to you. And when you use this framework, the more often you use it, the more often you prepare your instructions following this framework, following the elements that I'm going to introduce here, the better you'll get at it and the more confident you'll get. I want you to bear in mind, though, that any single instruction you give could contain all of the elements on this list that's going to come up, or only some of the elements in the list. I don't want you to feel that you've got to put all the elements into one instruction. So let's have a look at these elements in turn. First of all, we have a frame. Now, what do we mean by the frame? Well, the frame is a signal to your students that you've come to the end of the previous activity and you want to begin a new activity. So let's say they're doing some written exercise in their books, and you want to move from this written exercise to a speaking activity? Well, then you can use expressions such as all right, okay now, and then you can quite easily move into the summary of the task. So here you go. You have your students doing a written task. You want to move to a speaking task. So you get their attention with your frame. You go, okay, all right, now. And you slide into a summary of the new task. We're now going to do a crossword to revise some vocabulary. So you have in this example the summary of the task, which is doing a crossword, and the reason for the task to revise vocabulary. Now, adult learners usually like to know why they're doing a particular task or activity, so it's quite helpful and even motivating to them if they understand the reason why you're doing something. Then, the next element of your instruction is the organization. We're going to do a crossword to revise some vocabulary. Now, how are your students going to be working? So you could say something like, I want you to work alone first. And what will they actually be doing? What's the procedure? In this case here, with this example, they'll be, completing a crossword. So you could say, complete this crossword or fill out this questionnaire, rehearse a dialogue with your partner, write a script for a sketch. Okay, so let's revise that. Your first 4 elements are the frame to get their attention, brief summary of the task and purpose. Like here, we're going to do a crossword to revise some vocabulary. The organization. I want you to work alone. I'd like you to work in pairs. I'd like you to get into group of threes. The procedure. Write a script for a sketch. Rehearse the dialogue on page 27. Those are the first 4. Then we have the mode. Now, for some activities and tasks, it's quite helpful to tell your students whether they should focus on speaking, for example, or listening or writing. Have you ever had those speaking activities where the mode, the focus is actually speaking? You put your students into pairs and you find that they're actually taking notes about what their partner is saying. Okay, so it's important that your students know what they should be doing. And if this is important, say to your students, this is a speaking activity. Just talk to each other. You don't need your pens and papers. You don't need to write notes. Or you could say to them, this is a writing task. You'll need to have your pens and notebooks. And then it's always good to let your students know what the outcome of the activity is. What do you expect them to do after they've completed the activity? You could have, for instance, after a role play, you could say, after you've role played the scenario in your groups, we'll have 2 groups do the role play for us in front of the class. So they know, your students know what they're working towards. Is there a particular strategy that your students should be using? In a listening activity, for instance, you could highlight that they should be only listening for key information and not for detailed information. In addition to mode, outcome, and strategy, it is also helpful for students to know how much time they have. If you don't tell students how much time they have, they could take as much time as is comfortable to them on a particular task, or they could feel that they're in such a hurry that they'll do something in 5 minutes and not do it properly. So give them the timing, something like you have 15 minutes for this. And last but not least, give them a cue to begin work. Now, if you're checking understanding, you can give them the cue, obviously, after you're sure that everyone is clear about what they're doing. So you could say something as easily as, okay, let's begin, or off you go. So let's put it all together. We've looked at what causes instructions to fail. We've looked at how we can fix these problems. And we've looked at the elements of an instruction, elements that help us as a teacher organize our instructions in such a way that make our instructions logical and understandable for our learners. So first and foremost, don't forget, you need your students' eyes and ears. Make sure your students are listening to you and paying attention. Remember, it's no point speaking over the class. If you speak over the class, you're going to speak as loud as you can speak, and nobody's actually going to be actually listening to you. Keep your instructions simple and concise. Don't go on and on and on. Pause after each step. Sequence your instructions. You can only do that if you've actually understood what you want to do. And don't forget to use signposting language. Connected to language use, avoid complex language. Adjust your instructions to the level of your students. It usually helps if you just work with imperatives. Work with a partner, take out your exercise books, open your dictionaries, open your textbooks to page 27. Don't just tell your students what to do. Take the time to show them what to do. Show the materials, demonstrate an activity if you have to, and check understanding effectively. Remember, do not say, or do not ask, have you understood? Students are rarely going to tell you that they've not understood. And if they don't have the language ability or the confidence to tell you they haven't understood, you're not going to hear from them. So check, ask them to give you the instructions back. Ask stronger students to give the instructions. Ask them to prepare the instructions for all your routine activities. Use the framework. Don't forget your frame, your task and purpose, the mode, the outcome, the timing. All these are really, really important. And all these together will help you deliver effective instructions. So as we come to the end of this webinar today, let's reflect on a few things. My first question for you, I'd like you to think about your own instructions and try and think about situations where you've given instructions and they've fallen flat, or you found that you've struggled with your students. What was it about the instructions that confused your students? Can you identify anything there that confused your students about your instructions? Then on the basis of that, or even aside from that, what could you adopt from this webinar into your own instructions? Was it the framework for effective instructions? Was it the idea of making sure that you've got your learners' eyes and ears before you start with your instructions? Or was it the ideas of showing learners what to do and not just telling them what to do? Now, you as an experienced teacher, or even, any teacher really, you've probably developed your own strategies and have got strategies for your own success in class. What other advice do you have? for giving effective instructions that weren't covered in this webinar today. We'd love to hear from you. If you want more continuing professional development materials, do go to the Gallery Teachers website for more resources.